Imagine it is the 14th of March, 1971. You're a 38-year-old postal worker living in Dusseldorf, West Germany. You have spent the last 11 years doing everything right. You wake before sunrise. You walk the same route. You come home to a modest apartment on Grafenberger Allee, where your wife keeps a small kitchen garden. Your two children sleep in bunk beds in the room at the end of the hall. You have been saving since your wedding day, not a fortune, but enough. Enough that you feel, for the first time in your family's history, genuinely secure. You have roughly 18,000 Deutschmarks sitting in a savings account at the local Sparkasse, your neighborhood savings bank. It represents 9 years of discipline, 9 years of not taking the holiday to Spain, 9 years of repairing the shoes instead of replacing them. You believe in the system. You believe your savings are protected. You believe the government, above all else, wants what you want: stability. You have never heard of Milton Friedman. You do not know what a monetary policy committee is. You have never read a central bank report. Why would you? That is their job. Your job is to deliver the mail and save what you can. If you have ever wondered why the money in your account seems to slowly, quietly, invisibly lose its power, why things keep getting more expensive, even when you feel like nothing has changed, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a prediction. It is a pattern. It has played out in dozens of countries across more than a century. Governments do not just tolerate inflation. Many of them, quietly and deliberately, need it. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because here is what that postal worker in Dusseldorf did not know on that morning in 1971. 2 days earlier, on the 12th of March, the West German government had made a quiet decision that would ripple through his savings for the next decade. And he was not alone. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, a much larger decision was being prepared. One that would affect every single person on Earth who held savings in any form. President Nixon was weeks away from what economists now call the Nixon shock, the moment the United States unilaterally ended the gold standard and changed the rules of money for the world. The era of managed inflation had begun, and the people who understood what that meant quietly moved their money. The people who did not kept on saving. This video is about the quiet relationship between governments and inflation. Not the emergency, panic room kind of inflation that makes the news when it reaches double digits. The slow, polite, respectable kind. The kind that runs at 2, 3, 4% per year, year after year, decade after decade. The kind that governments say they are fighting even as they engineer conditions for it. And the kind that, if you understand its purpose, stops feeling random and starts feeling inevitable. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about what inflation actually does. Not what it appears to do on the surface, but what it accomplishes underneath, where governments and central banks do their real work. Think of government debt as a very long mortgage. And when a government borrows money, say $1 billion in the form of bonds, it promises to pay that money back in the future with interest. The problem is that governments borrow enormous amounts so large that paying them back in full, in real terms, would require savage tax increases or brutal cuts to spending. Both of those things lose elections. Both of those things cause social unrest. So governments face a choice. You can tax your people painfully to pay off your debts, you can cut services and face protests in the streets, or you can do something quieter. You can inflate the debt away. Here is how that works. If the government owes $1 trillion and inflation runs at 4% per year for 10 years, the real value, the actual purchasing power, of that debt shrinks dramatically without anyone officially canceling anything. The number stays the same on paper, but the money used to repay it is worth far less than the money borrowed. It is the financial equivalent of repaying a loan with lighter coins. The lender gets back the correct number of coins, but each coin buys less bread than it used to. The government wins. The bondholder quietly loses. And no politician had to stand up at a podium and say the words, "We are not going to pay you back fully." This is the mechanism. This is the engine running quietly underneath the respectable language of monetary policy. It has a formal name: debt monetization or fiscal dominance, depending on the context. But in plain words, it means using inflation as a tool to reduce the burden of debt in ways that voters never quite see clearly enough to get angry about. And it has been used, in different forms, by governments across the modern world for over 100 years. This brings us directly to the first case study. And this one is not the obvious Weimar Germany example. This one is closer, quieter, and far more instructive about how the game is actually played. The United States between 1946 and 1980 ran one of the longest and most deliberate debt reductions. At the end of World War II, the United States government carried a debt load of roughly 119% of GDP, meaning the government owed more than the entire country produced in a single year. That number, by any measure, was unsustainable. There was no realistic way to tax Americans enough, to pay it off without destroying the post-war recovery before it even started. So the federal government and the Federal Reserve made a series of decisions. They were never quite announced as a policy, but they functioned as one. Between 1945 and 1980, the United States ran average annual inflation of roughly 4.2%. Interest rates were kept for much of that period below the rate of inflation, meaning savers who held government bonds were receiving interest that did not keep up with rising prices. In real terms, they were losing money while believing they were being prudent. By 1980, the debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen from 119% to roughly 32%, not because of fiscal discipline, not because of dramatic tax increases, but because inflation had quietly eroded the real value of that debt over 35 years. The average American family during this period was not destroyed. Life improved in many ways. The post-war boom was real. But here's the part that matters. Families who held their savings in cash or low-interest accounts watched the real purchasing power of that money quietly diminish year after year. A family that saved $10,000 in 1945 and kept it in a savings account earning 2%, while inflation ran at 4% per year, did not, in any meaningful sense, save that money. They slowly, politely, invisibly gave a portion of it to the government's debt problem. They never signed anything that said so. No one ever asked their permission. Meanwhile, families who owned homes, physical assets whose prices rose with inflation, came out ahead. The asset was doing the work that cash could not. The house was inflating in nominal value, meaning the dollar number on it went up, even as the real economy shifted beneath everyone's feet. This was not an accident. Property ownership and inflation have a relationship that goes back centuries. And those who understood it, whether by education, inheritance, or luck, held a different financial outcome. This leads to the second part of this story. For this, we travel to the landscape of 1990s Japan. Before we go further, if a government told you it planned to reduce the value of your savings, would you change where you kept your money? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Japan in the 1980s was the envy of the world. Its economy had grown at an extraordinary rate for decades. Its companies were buying landmarks. Its stock market, the Nikkei, reached nearly 39,000 points in December 1989. Land prices in Tokyo had become so astronomical that the grounds of the Imperial Palace were theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. Every salary worker believed the story. The story was that Japan had invented a new and permanent kind of prosperity. Then the floor gave way. But the cracks had been spreading for years. The Bank of Japan, responding to the bubble, sharply raised interest rates beginning in 1989. The Nikkei lost 48% of its value in 1990 alone. Property prices collapsed. The construction companies and banks were suddenly holding enormous debts backed by cheap assets. And here is where the government's relationship with inflation becomes especially instructive. Japan spent the following 3 decades, from 1990 to roughly 2020, trying to create inflation, not to reduce it, to create it. Because deflation, falling prices, sounds like it should be good. But sustained deflation is a slow economic poison. When prices fall, people delay purchases, waiting for things to get cheaper. When people delay purchases, businesses earn less. When businesses earn less, they cut wages and jobs. When wages fall, people spend even less. It is a downward spiral that is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Japan's government borrowed and borrowed to stimulate the economy. Its national debt rose to scary levels, eventually exceeding 200% of GDP, making it the highest debt-to-income ratio of any major nation. The strategy to manage this debt was, again, the quiet inflation play. Keep interest rates near zero, to make borrowing cheap, and to try to generate the inflation that would erode the real burden of debt. The difference in Japan's case is that it took far longer to work than anyone anticipated. The lesson of Japan is not that inflation failed. It is that the attempt to use monetary tools to manage a debt crisis can drag on for decades, affecting the financial lives of ordinary workers. Japanese workers in the 1990s entered a labor market where wages stagnated and insecurity rose. They did everything their parents told them to do. The system had changed without announcement. Now, here's where it gets interesting. What happened in Japan produced a policy playbook exported globally. This brings us to our third case study, and this one is still unfolding. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the United States, collapsed. What followed was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The U.S. government responded with bank bailouts and a radical new policy called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, or QE, is a process where a central bank creates new money electronically and uses it to buy government bonds. In plain words, the central bank prints money to prop up markets. Between 2008 and 2015, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $900 billion to $4.5 trillion. The Bank of England and the European Central Bank all ran similar programs. The stated goal was to prevent deflation and stimulate growth. They succeeded at preventing depression. But here's what happened in the process. Interest rates were held near zero for years. This meant that ordinary savers were receiving returns that ran below the rate of inflation. In real terms, their savings were losing value every single year while the policy ran. At the same time, the prices of financial assets, stocks and real estate, rose sharply. The people who owned those assets grew wealthier. The people who did not fell further behind. This produced one of the largest transfers of wealth in the history of the modern world, not through taxation, but through monetary policy, the quiet mechanism of interest rates. And then came 2021. The pandemic had prompted even more aggressive money creation. When supply chains broke and demand surged, inflation became very loud. By June 2022, U.S. inflation reached 9.1%, the highest rate since 1981. Across the Eurozone, the figure reached 10.6%. The mechanism became impossible to ignore. Most people watching the news thought they were seeing something new. They were not. They were seeing the same mechanism they had always lived under, just at a higher volume. Most people will never know what you now know. They will trust systems they do not understand, watching their purchasing power erode while nodding at the language of monetary management. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because this part matters. Now observe what all of these cases have in common: America, Japan, and the post-2008 world. Look at all three together, and the same shape appears underneath the different circumstances. In every case, a government faced a debt burden that was politically impossible to resolve directly. You cannot tell your voters you are raising taxes by 40% to pay for debts. You cannot cut public services dramatically without social unrest that threatens governments. So the resolution happens through the third door, the one that does not have a sign on it, the one where the real value of the debt is reduced gradually through inflation, through low real interest rates and the quiet transformation of the relationship between money and time. And in every case, the people who suffered most were those who had done what they were told, the savers, the people who believed that putting money in a bank, in a pension, in a government bond was the prudent and virtuous thing to do. The people who did not understand that the very system they were trusting to protect their savings was using those savings as part of the solution to a problem they had never been asked to vote on. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Think about what this means for the relationship between an ordinary citizen and their government when it comes to money. There's a foundational assumption built into how most people relate to savings. The assumption that the government wants the same thing you want from your money, that it wants your savings to hold their value, that the protection of purchasing power, the real practical meaning of your savings, is a shared goal. The historical record suggests this assumption is, at best, incomplete. Not because governments are malicious, not because there is a room of villains twisting dials, but because governments face structural pressures that make inflation useful in ways that deflation and full debt repayment are not. Inflation reduces the real burden of debt. It reduces the real cost of public sector wages over time. It provides central banks with room to cut interest rates when the next crisis arrives, which requires rates to be above zero in the first place. It stimulates asset prices in ways that generate tax revenues. The incentives point in one direction. And the people who manage monetary policy are not unaware of this. This brings us to the human dimension of this story, because we can talk about percentages and policy mechanisms for a long time, but every percentage point of inflation represents something real happening in someone's life. Consider what historians and economists have documented about the specific populations most affected by inflationary periods. Pensioners and retirees on fixed incomes are consistently among the hardest hit. A person who retired in the United Kingdom in 1970 with a fixed pension had seen the real value of that income fall by roughly 75% by 1980. 10 years of double-digit inflation in the 1970s had not destroyed the nominal number printed on the pension check, but it had devastated what that number could actually buy. Food, heating, medicine. These things did not stay the same price, while the pension stood still. In Argentina, a country that has experienced multiple severe inflationary crises across its modern history, including a period in 1989 when inflation reached an annualized rate of over 3,000%, the pattern was stark and brutal. Middle-class families who had saved in Argentine pesos watched those savings dissolve. A business owner in Buenos Aires who had built a small manufacturing company over 20 years found in 1989 that the pesos in his account could not buy the raw materials he needed to keep the lights on for a month. He had not mismanaged his business. He had not made reckless decisions. He had saved in the wrong form in a currency controlled by a government that had, over decades, chosen inflation as the solution to its fiscal problems rather than making harder structural choices. Small business owners are consistently vulnerable in inflationary periods for a specific reason. Their costs, Labor, materials, energy rise in real time with inflation. But their ability to pass those costs on to customers through higher prices is limited by what the market will bear, by long-term contracts they cannot easily renegotiate, and by the fear of losing customers to competitors who absorb the costs longer. The small restaurant owner, the local contractor, the family hardware shop, all of them operate on thin enough margins that sustained inflation does not just reduce their profits, it can eliminate them. Contrast this with what happens to those who hold real assets. Real estate, productive land, equity in businesses with pricing power, commodities. The value of a well-located piece of real estate in an inflationary environment does not stay flat. It rises, often roughly in line with inflation, because the alternative, keeping money in cash, becomes less attractive. The landlord whose property is rising in nominal value, while the mortgage against it was taken out years ago at a fixed rate, is structurally in a position very similar to the government. They borrowed in more valuable money. They are repaying in less valuable money. The asset is doing something that savings accounts cannot do. This is not a moral statement about landlords. It is a mechanical observation about how inflation distributes its effects unevenly across different kinds of wealth. And the historical record across every major inflationary period of the 20th and 21st centuries consistently shows the same division. Those who held claims on real things came through these periods better than those who held claims on money. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. What did the people who came through major inflationary periods with their financial lives intact actually do differently? The historical record shows that those who survived these periods largely shared three observable characteristics. The first was a willingness to question the assumption that cash is safe, not reckless speculation, not abandonment of discipline, but a recognition, often hard-won through direct experience or through family history, that money stored as money is subject to the decisions of governments and central banks in ways that money stored as productive assets is not. Families in Germany who had lived through the hyperinflation of 1923, when prices doubled every few days and people famously needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, carried a deep cultural memory of this into subsequent generations. German household behavior, even decades later, showed an unusual preference for real assets, for property, for gold, for tangible things over financial abstractions. This was not paranoia. It was the application of historical pattern recognition to practical financial decisions. The second observable characteristic was geographic and currency diversification. People who survived Argentina's repeated crises, the hyperinflation of 1989, the peso collapse of 2001, the ongoing currency pressures of more recent decades, were often those who had maintained savings in more than one form and in more than one place. Not because they were sophisticated investors, often simply because they or their parents had been through enough cycles to know that no single government, no single currency, no single institutional promise was perfectly reliable over the long term. The lesson was not cynicism. It was redundancy. The same lesson a farmer learns about keeping seed stock from multiple locations. The third characteristic was an understanding of the difference between nominal value and real value. Nominal means the number. Real means what the number actually buys. A person who understood this distinction, intuitively or through education, did not celebrate a savings account that grew by 3% in a year when inflation ran at 5%. They understood that the number going up was an illusion. Their actual purchasing power had declined. This distinction between the map and the territory, between the number and what the number represents, was the single most consistent factor separating those who recognized what was happening around them from those who did not. The historical record does not prescribe specific actions. People navigated these periods in enormously varied ways, depending on their starting resources, their locations, their families, their specific timing. What it does show, with remarkable consistency across countries and decades, is that awareness of the mechanism, the quiet structural tendency of governments facing debt to favor inflation over harder alternatives, was itself a form of protection. Not because awareness alone changes outcomes, but because awareness changes the questions you ask. And the questions you ask change the decisions you make. This is not financial advice. Every person's situation is different. The purpose here is historical pattern recognition, not prescription. Now, let us return to Düsseldorf, to the postal worker on Grafenberger Allee, with his 18,000 Deutschmarks and his 2 children in bunk beds and his 9 years of repairing shoes. His name, in the way that most stories like his are told, is not recorded in any archive. He was not a politician or a banker. He was not a historian. He was one of millions of ordinary West German workers who had rebuilt their lives in the post-war economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, the real and extraordinary growth that had lifted Germany from rubble to prosperity. He had every reason to trust the system. The system had performed miracles. But between 1971 and 1981, West German inflation averaged around 6% annually. Not catastrophic, not Weimar, nothing close to wheelbarrows of cash, but sustained, real, and compounding. By 1981, those 18,000 marks, if left in a standard savings account, earning rates that consistently ran below inflation, would have lost somewhere between 30 and 40% of their real value. Not the number. The number grew. The real value, what the money could actually buy, shrank. Meanwhile, the West German colleague who had bought an apartment in 1971 instead of renting, who had taken on debt denominated in marks that were then relatively valuable, found a decade later that the nominal value of that apartment had risen substantially, that the real value of the mortgage against it had shrunk with inflation, and that the decision to buy rather than save in cash had placed them on the right side of the mechanism. The postal workers' story is not a tragedy. Life went on. The Deutschmark was stable. Germany's institutional commitment to price stability, born from the cultural memory of 1923, made West German inflation relatively mild by international standards. But even mild inflation carries its effects, and those effects are not distributed equally. The lesson of this video is not that governments are enemies. It is not that saving is foolish or that systems are to be abandoned. The lesson is simple. The relationship between governments and inflation is not adversarial. It is structural. Governments face pressures that make inflation useful in ways that are rarely named honestly in public. The historical record across a dozen countries in 100 years makes this pattern clear. Seeing it does not require cynicism. It requires only the willingness to look at what has actually happened again and again, and to ask who benefited and who paid. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. Most people will hear the word inflation and think only about prices at the grocery store, the surface, not the structure. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it changes the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more of this kind of historical clarity, and I will see you in the next one.